So my name's Adam Vane, and over the last 20 years, thanks to my education here, I've had the opportunity to work and support through training and coaching programs CEOs of Fortune 500s and their executive teams, mid-sized companies and startups, and the question of leadership often comes up. And there are a lot of lenses to leadership. And you could map some of those lenses to some of the schools here. So for the business school, there's strategic planning. In psychology, there's talent management. There's a law lens, right? There's a public relation lens. But in working and speaking to CEO advisory groups, peer advisory groups for many, many years, and some of the conversations that come up at tables where different CEOs and leaders talk to each other, those aren't necessarily the kinds of lenses that come up. Oftentimes, what comes up in those conversations are difficult conversations. And a difficult conversation is any conversation where the thought of having it gives you sort of a funny feeling, like a queasiness in the pit of your stomach. And you know you need to have this conversation, but something is stopping you, right? There are a number of things. Maybe you're not quite sure how to handle it. So there's a skill problem, and or it may be just a fight or flight response that we're learning more and more about as we study the neuro aspects of leadership. But there's not only a psychological cost, there's also a financial cost. And the last major study of conflict and difficult conversations in 2008 by Consulting Psychologists Press, they assessed in conversations with 5,000 leaders and managers around the world. And just the US cost of difficult conversations was $360 billion in paid hours, 385 million working days. And when they began to divide that out into these subcategories, 80% of respondents experienced conflict with other departments and teams. 65% said there are too many cooks in the kitchen, and there's confusion about who is doing what. 40% said communication with organizational leadership is ineffective, and 25% said just trying to avoid conflict kills morale and causes illness and absence from work. That sound familiar to you? Right. So there are 4 costly sources of conflict. The first is when you have a relationship and you have the same level of power. Right? 2 peers. So that's peer conflict. We need to learn how to manage that. Meeting management, that's where, say, you're running a meeting and 3 people are silent and 1 person is taking up all the space in the room. How many people have ever been in that situation? Right? So that's very costly. Managing up is where you're managing up to power, right? And we know that that's a huge problem because we're afraid that, that's when our limbic system, that part of our brain that triggers the neurochemical fight or flight response, that's where that really goes crazy. Our prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic, shuts down, and then we really become afraid. But the one we're going to talk about today is managing down, performance management, where you have some authority or level of power and you're trying to give feedback to someone who reports to you. Okay? So the goals for the session first are to understand the impact of personal style and communication styles on how we deliver information. I'm going to go over 2 guardrails, and what I mean by guardrails is there some sort of place of safety we can go to when we're delivering these performance management conversations that give us the room and the space to deliver the feedback we want to deliver and influence other people to our way of thinking. And the third is we're going to go over 7 steps of performance feedback, and there's a handout on your table we'll review. Okay? So for the first exercise, what I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes and think back. Think back over the last 2 weeks, and is there a time, one situation where you gave performance feedback that wasn't well received, or think about a time when you could have given performance feedback and didn't, and now you're thinking about it, it's keeping you up at night. I want you to take a minute in order that we can make this real and not just something that's intellectual, but something real, and just think about that. and maybe make a few notes. Okay? Give you 1 minute to do that. Okay, so what I want to do now, if you have something, is I want to very quickly go over the communication styles that have been studied for many, many years, going back to Hippocrates and the study of the four humors, right through Carl Jung and his work on behavior, and through other people like Isabel Myers and Lucy Briggs, who came up with the Myers-Briggs typology, DISC, social styles. How many people are familiar or have taken some kind of psychometric like that and are familiar? So each one of these, there's a four-quadrant model. And what we know is in these four quadrants are sort of places of focus or energy. And we in each of those four areas, we have all four of those within us. But we tend to have a primary energy that we focus on and a secondary. And usually there's one Achilles heel, one of those places of energy where it's very low for us. And it's the person in our organization who has that as their primary style, the person that we have the conflict with. Over and over and over, that seems to be what happens. So, sorry, I got a little. So, if we think about the first one, which is what we call that driver energy, which is that which is in us, that is really focused on action and results. This is the part of us that wants our results done now, right? Come on, let's get it done, people. Very low affect. Let's go, let's get it done. The challenge with that style, though, is people that follow that style tend to be less tactful, right? In fact, of all four styles, those people tend to be the worst listeners. And I'll say that again for those of you that are drivers in the room. Tend to be the worst listeners. Okay, how many people know someone, managing someone in that style, that's their primary style? How many people know that they are that style? Right. The second is the expressive. These are people that love recognition, fun, applause. They love to be seen. And as a result, they tend to talk a lot. And what do they talk about? Themselves, right? Oh, that reminds me of me. Let me tell you a story. Right? And that's great. We need a focus on ideas and that sort of temporal focus on the future. Right, that creativity, that's very important. But the challenge is, for that style, people in that primary style, is they tend to be less organized. And they tend to sort of like great starters, but not so great finishers. How many people know somebody in that style or are that style? And you're managing that. The third style is the relators. Those are people who really value people. These are people who are sensitive. They're great. They're the best listeners of all of them. Right? And they tend to focus on, I want to hear more about you, Tom. Hey, how are you? Nice to see you, right? And they tend to, they're very friendly, but underneath the surface of that friendliness, the way that they manage difficult situations is they have difficulty asking for what they want. So they will then accommodate and then feel resentful. So that's going to be the person on your team who, yeah, it's fine, boss. Yeah, it's great. No problem. Yeah, it's great. In the meantime, they've got this sort of book. And every time they get crossed, there's a little X that they put there. And then there's another X. And then there's another X. And finally, when they get to the bottom of the page, that's when they explode. So those are the people you have to say, no, I really want to hear what you have to say. No, you really need to take a vacation. Because they will accommodate and just keep pushing themselves because their focus is on people and consensus and doing for others. The fourth is the analytical style. These are people that value accuracy and data. And they're all about making sure that we get things right. And if you want something done right, then you give it to someone who has an analytical style. But if you want it done on time, not so much. Because they can tend to get stuck in analysis paralysis. And if you ever worked with an IT department, you can know that's like there's not enough data in the world to be able to execute. How many people know that style? Familiar with that? Okay, so those are the four styles we want to be aware of. Now, the best way to steer behavior, okay, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the best way to steer behavior, and particularly for alumni leaders, the best way to steer behavior is to positively motivate, right? So people need to know that what they do matters to you. So if you could just make a list of the people that are on your team, or the people, if you're a volunteer leader, and think about ways to fuel their sense of importance. That's the best way to steer behavior. But that's, unfortunately, not what we're here to talk about today, right? So let me just hear from you. What are some examples of some challenging feedback conversations that you've got? Yes?
I have a person on my team who's really good and accurate, but has a bad attitude. And I don't know if it's something she can change. She's a really valuable team member, so I haven't told her to.
So a bad attitude. Now, what is it about the bad attitude when you think about behavior? How does she exhibit that bad attitude?
Looking for blame instead of finding a solution. And she will find a solution.
Oh, so she's good at finding a solution.
But then she wants to blame people.
Oh, she wants to blame other people.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. So you guys want to get into it? So let's take a look. Take your hand out. So there are a couple of guardrails we want to be aware of. And because one of the reasons that I'm sure that it's difficult to give this person feedback is like, how do you get into this without getting a lot of blowback? Am I right? Right. So the first guardrail. So these are the guardrails. Guardrails are what keep us on the path. Okay? So the first is positions. So when I say the word position, all difficult conversations start with a position. A position is just a way of looking at something, right? I'm taking a position, and your position is, wow, she's blaming other people, and she sure gets it done, but unfortunately, there's a side part of it that happens that's not really helpful, all right? So here's the problem with positions. Newtonian theory states, for every action, there's an equal and opposite. Right, and I'm here to tell you that for every position you take, there's an equal and opposite position, right? So here's how that works in organizations. Let's say that I'm just going to take it away from this for a moment. Let's say that I am a manager of a function in an organization, and Claire is my colleague, and she's also manager of a function. And the truth is, I was supposed to get Claire a report last week that she really needed, but my boss, Tom, came to me with a hot assignment, and he said, you really got to do this. You want to keep your job. So I wasn't able to get that report to Claire. So now it's next week. I'm walking down the hall. I see Claire, and I've completely forgotten about that. And I've got my iPad. I'm walking down the hall and I say, hey, Claire, how's it going? She says, hey, Adam. She kind of gives me a look, right? Now, what's the right thing to do right now? What would be the right thing for me to do right now? Stop. Hey, Claire, I'm so sorry about last week. Look, I had this hot assignment I had to do for Tom. But look, if this ever happens again, I promise you, I'll let you know in 5 minutes if I can't get something to you. That's called the future-focused agreement to rebuild trust, right? But I don't do that because my mind's working all the time. So instead, I walk back to my office. I say, hi, Claire. She says, hey, Adam. She kind of gives me a look. I walk back to my office, and I think, wow, she had kind of a phony tone in her voice. Then I get back to the office. I go, I remember. And now the right thing to do now would be what? Now that I remember I'm back in my office, what's the right thing to do now? Call her up on the phone. But that's not what I do. Here's what I do. Because I'd like to think of myself as a good person, and I want to make sure that I'm a good person. I go to my colleague, Kathleen. I say, hey, Kathleen, you got a minute to talk? Remember our team was supposed to get that report to Claire last week, and then we didn't because you know how busy we were, and you know how Claire is. She begins to make me right. Meantime, Claire goes to her colleague, Karen. She says, Karen, remember Adam was supposed to get me that report last week? No, but he didn't, but you know how that team is, right? And that is called positional escalation. Now, what we tend to do as human beings is we tend to hope it's going to work out, but it doesn't. The nature of conflict is that it tends to escalate. So the first guardrail is to recognize that things will positionally escalate. Everybody with me so far? Which brings us, and the way that they escalate is the way the limbic system, the survival system of the brain works. They will move into a fight pattern, especially the drivers will move into a fight pattern because they tend to control, or a flight pattern, which is what the relators and the analyticals will do, right? A flight pattern, or they might attack and withdraw and some passive-aggressive behavior, right? The second guardrail is something I call intelligent confusion. And if you can transform your judgment and frustration into this thing called intelligent confusion and curiosity, it's the second best step to managing this conversation. And the way to do that is you want to ask an open-ended question, because open-ended questions are non-positional. Remember, we're trying to avoid positions. And one of my favorite ways to very quickly drop out of the limbic neurochemistry that's driving us into illogical things coming out of our mouths is a very central open-ended question called "Help me understand." And so what I'd like to do that I found useful is I'd like for you all to repeat after me, "Help me understand." Help me understand. 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 If you did nothing else, then the next time you found yourself frustrated, you simply move to "help me understand." It will change your life, I promise you. Because "help me understand" is non-positional. What are they going to say if you say "help me understand"? They're going to say, "How dare you ask me more about what I think and feel?" Now, I will say that because that limbic chemistry, the cortisol and norepinephrine, is firing in those situations, when I learned this many, many years ago as a young manager, this is how I did it. I'm like, "Can you help me understand?" You know, I had to force myself to say it, you know, and there were the facial tics and everything else. So let me talk about where that has worked in some of the work that I've done. So about 90% of my work is private sector, but one of the things that we do in our consulting practice is we work with high-level UN leaders to help them to guide teams, face down hostile press interviews, and negotiate with rebel factions in Afghanistan and Sudan and Algeria. And I'm proud to say there are 33 country directors around the world that we have worked with and helped to get to this high-level role. So one person gave me permission to tell the story, and this was Doug Kay. You can actually look him up on the internet. And Doug was chief of staff of UN peacekeeping. And he came to me and he said, "You know, I'm tired of having this kind of role where it's kind of an admin role, chief of staff. I really want to go in the front lines. It's something I did before." So this is what you have to do to get to this role. You've already been in the UN for about 10 or 15 years. Now, in order to pass this role, you get a test. And the test is they fly you to London, and the night before this whole weekend-long test, they give you a briefing book about this thick. And you've got to memorize that book all night to simulate being exhausted on the ground. So you have to have all that data in your head. Then, first thing in the morning, they put you in a room and they hire actors to put you through 4 or 5 different scenarios. And each one of those scenarios maps on to the 4 kinds of difficult conversations that I talked about earlier. So the first thing you do is you're sitting in there and someone playing a rebel factional leader comes storming in and going, "What are you doing in my country?" and screaming at you. And the test is you have 20 minutes to sort of calm that person down and come up with an agreement, a future-focused agreement. And there are 2 people sitting there with lists, with competency boxes, and they're checking it off. And in that 20 minutes, if you are too aggressive, you fail. If you're too passive, you fail. If you're still talking at the end of 20 minutes, they walk out of the room, you fail, and you lose those points. Next, they put you in front of someone you have to give performance feedback to who's very politically connected and belligerent. Next, they put you a room full of angry stakeholders, and you've got 20 minutes to come up with a strategic plan that's sort of short-term, medium-term, long-term, using some of the data in the briefing book. Next, they then put you in front of a hostile press interview. So that's managing up. That's the managing up piece, right? So Doug, we worked with Doug. He went through, he passed the test. And it took him about a year to get this role, but he actually got the role of being country director of the largest UN agency in the world in Kabul, Afghanistan. And so he's 6 months in the role, and we're connected on Facebook. And I see, and you can see this video where he's facing down this press interview, if you look up his name, Doug Kay. But he just nailed it. He nailed this press interview. And so I IM'd him. I said, "Doug, that was just so incredible what you did. I'm so proud of you, et cetera, et cetera." And he IM'd me right back from Kabul. He says, "I have to tell you, I use the principles we talked about every day, including help me understand." So if it works for him, maybe it'll work for you. Yes. Now, there's another way for the data-oriented people in the room. When you think about the way communication is sent through the ethos, right? We know it's that we send it through body language and tone of voice and facial expressions. But when you just think about the content itself, there's a certain percentage of content as you're speaking to people that gets lost and some that gets kept and integrated. And what do you think, percentage-wise, as I'm sending information out, what percentage do you think is kept and what percentage do you think is lost on average? 1%'s kept. 10 kept, 90, yeah. 10, 90, anybody else?
Pareto, 80-20.
What's that? 80-20? Yeah, that's right. So Pareto is right. 20 to 25%, 75 to 80% lost. So does that sound right to people? Okay. If you agree with that, then you remember earlier when I said if you can transform your judgment and frustration to intelligent confusion, what you've all just admitted to is that you are confused 85 to 90% of the time. You've just admitted that, and that is the truth. We tend to be very confused about our position. There's some confusion here about your position. She has a whole story about why she blames or why she's doing what she's doing. The trick is, how do we get into this in a way that we bring out the truth of what's in the middle? Because by staying in our position, we tend to keep, here's the thing, you are all, from my experience, you're all 5 minutes away from a breakthrough in some of the most difficult conversations you're dealing with, but you never had the chance to really practice or learn how to do this. 5 minutes away. But the 5 minutes tends to be, it's like, here's you with your positions, here's the other person with their positions, and as you hold on to those positions, you're always 5 minutes away. You get it? You're like pushing it away. So let's go over the handout. So the first thing you want to do is you want to do it quickly, face-to-face, and in private. And some of the language here, by the way, what I'm talking about, please, I hope you know that these are all suggestions. You will have your own way of saying whatever you say, so I never ask you to do it exactly like I do it. You always have it make sense to you. But there is some language here that I think is useful. So do it quickly, face-to-face, and in private. Management Skills 101 is you never give feedback in public, because that's highly embarrassing to people. And they will find a way to either consciously or unconsciously sabotage you. Okay? So, hey, Kim, I'd like to check in with something I've noticed. Why do we use the word noticed? Because noticed is non-positional. They can't say, you didn't notice that, right? If you come in with, why did you do this? Well, they can come up with a defense. So you want to stay non-positional. So what was it that you noticed specifically about this person?
Starting the conversation. Were you asking?
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I looked away.
Like, not only focus on the problem and where did you talk?
Okay. So what specifically have they said recently that would be an example of that? They said, oh, Carrie, do you remember the language?
I'm going to talk about this third team member again, but I came in on the Monday and blah, blah, blah.
Okay. What does the third team, let's give the third team member an imaginary name.
Charles.
And let's give this person an imaginary name.
Kim.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the first step would be, hey, Kim, you got a second to talk? Right? And the reason we say, do you have a second to talk, even though I'm a boss, is you always want to give the space for choice. Because when they say yes, every time they say yes, right, that is an agreement. And every time there's an agreement, they are motivated internally to keep their word. So the small yeses that get you to the future focus agreement we're looking for here are very important to bring this forward. So, hey, so can you play Kim for a second? Sure. Hey, Kim, do you have a second to talk? Hey, so I wanted to talk, one of the things I noticed the other day was when you were talking about the project, I really appreciate, first of all the work you've done and just your solution-focused, way of doing things around here. I noticed that you had some issue around Charles. So what was that all about?
Well, Charles is great, but he's careless, and he pays attention to details and takes action.
Okay. So for you, Charles is not paying attention to a lot of details. You get a sense of what style Kim is? Which style is Kim? Analytical, right? Maybe. Is that true? A lot of details are extremely important to her?
Yeah.
Low affect? Yeah, that's right. So already now you have some sense of what's important to her, which are details, right? So, Kim, one of the things I appreciate of you is that you're very detail-focused. And it's because you're detail-focused that I wanted to have this conversation with you, which is that I noticed when you give your on the way to solutions, one of the things I've noticed is that you really have an issue around how Charles is doing something. No, I know. And so here's what you want to do. You want to begin the next step is to ask questions and paraphrase. So you want to get to surround them with their own truth, because they all have a story. Now, the reason that we don't allow them to do this, the reason that we interrupt, right, is because unconsciously we feel like if we allow them to continue to talk to us, we will die. I'm serious. That's what's happening. That's the message that the oldest part of your brain is sending you. If I don't interrupt right now and get my side out, I'm going to die. But really, when you think about how long does it take you to tell your side of a story, how long does it take? If you're say if you were Kim and you're complaining about this to a friend, how long really would it take to tell that story? 5 minutes. That's the 5 minutes. We don't take time to fully hear the other side of the story. So Kim, for you, it's all about Charles. So tell me a little bit more about Charles.
Charles is very friendly and motivated, but a lot going on, and sometimes he's a little bit overwhelmed, and he starts to do things at once, he doesn't finish them, and then it comes back to them. And then when I pick up, because we both really do some things, I find his.
So what I'm doing is I'm validating her side of the story. And what I'm doing is down-regulating, if you wanted the technical term, the allostatic load into the lateral nucleus of her amygdala that is going to keep her defending. So there's about 5 minutes of that, okay? So you see that's step number 3. Now, what's the downstream impact of her doing this? Why do we care that she complains? Who cares? Where?
In the team.
So she does it with other people. Okay.
It's a lot of contribution. It's Charles who's there, so.
Right.
And then other people take it.
Yes.
She's
And we don't have to get into a whole psychological thing. We just have to get to the behavior, right? So we're always trying to describe the behavior and move away from evaluations. Describe the behavior. So Kim, so I can understand how it's very frustrating because you're trying to get things done. I get that. Do you mind if I share with you sort of what I've noticed? Kim? Right, so now we're beginning to move to deliver feedback on the behavior, not the person. Right? So what I've noticed is that you share that with me, and I can understand how frustrating that is with you. And I'm wondering, it seems to me that you're sharing it with other people as well, your frustration with Charles. Am I right? A little bit? So when you think about sharing your frustrations with people, now, this is where we see we're step 5, we're starting to go into the downstream impact. Here's the thing about downstream impact. You need to pull the downstream impact out of her mouth to a state of realization. So she realizes what she's doing. That's the open-ended questions that are non-positional that begin to pull the truth out of her rather than mine saying, you've been talking a lot to other team members and that's really not a good thing. No, I haven't. Yes, you have. No, I haven't. There we are for positional escalation. Trying to avoid that. Everybody with me so far? Okay, so we want to move to the downstream impact, and my goal is to pull the downstream impact from her. So Kim, I can understand how it's so frustrating when Charles doesn't come through around the execution of what he's promised. And one of the things I've noticed that you've shared that with me, and so have you also shared this with others? Right. And when you think about sharing that frustration with others, what do you think the impact is on the team? Not the best. Exactly. See what I did? I got her to admit it. So I guess, when we think about sort of team, now you can get into all the stuff that you talked about to me earlier here. When we think about team cohesion, collaboration, I guess I'm just wondering, what sort of steps you could take to kind of maybe ameliorate this. What would that be?
I don't really know. I kind of just wanted to do a better job. I really think that's what she was saying.
I want you to be her. And I completely understand. Notice all I'm doing is paraphrasing back and understanding her point of view so that she doesn't get positional. I can completely understand you're being frustrated. And again, coming back to the sort of the side conversation where you're sharing that with others, I'm just wondering how effective that's been with Charles. Right, exactly, Kim. I don't think he knows either. And so what I'm wondering is that by complaining to other people about it, is that solving the problem? Right, so it may be, in fact, creating another problem, right? Yeah, great. Thank you, Kim. So that's why I'm wanting to know what steps. See, I'm trying to pull it. I'm not trying to say, could you stop doing that? I can do that, but I'm trying to pull out of her. Everybody with me? So what can I count on you for around this, around the way you're sort of just spreading it out? Because I'll help you with Charles. No. I'm going to help her by coaching her.
I don't necessarily need to be saying it.
Exactly. So can I count on you for that?
Yeah.
Okay. Now I have a future-focused agreement. She has made a promise, and now she's motivated by her interest in keeping her word. Now she's internally motivated. Everybody see what I'm doing here? Okay, I'm going to take some more questions. Yeah.
Do those leading questions to get the other to agree. How do you do that so that it doesn't become gotcha? I've had situations where people have done that to me, and it's very condescending in a way.
Yes.
It doesn't need,
Yes.
so it has to be done right.
Because
What is
the way to do it is to bring authenticity and real caring to the conversation. And here's what happened to me. This is how I got to it, because it's not an easy thing, because you've got all this stuff going on, and you're like, how do you think it is when you begin to talk to other people, right? That can come across that way. So you've got to move to real intelligent confusion, and here's how I got there. When you actually begin to move to help me understand, this is what happened to me years ago. And I would say, so help me understand. And I'd say, wasn't it about A, B, and C? Isn't that what it was about? And they'd say, no, boss, it was about, something else. Don't you remember? We said we were going to use this particular supplier. And I go, and then I began to realize how confused I was. And over time, as I began to realize how confused I was, as opposed to intellectually understanding it, which is what we're getting to here today, which is why you're asking a very good question, as you really move to intelligent confusion and understand how confused you are about what's going on around you, you actually move to a natural place of, I really want to know. It's not easy, especially if you notice yourself having that, but the more authentic you can be, the less you're going to be tripped up by that. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so I'm going to just go over a case and we'll take more questions. So this was a brilliant CEO of a $50 million tech firm. And investment bankers love this guy. He is a classic expressive, right? Attorneys love him. He's built this company from nothing. And the call I got was actually from his partners, because it seems as though he had gone to the Steve Jobs School of Management. And by that I mean he was having emotional outbursts, right? And he was so micromanaging that he wasn't able to travel on the road and pull in the kind of work he needed to do. So, what we needed to do as part of the goals of the coaching program was to reduce the emotional outbursts, teach him some feedback skills, and get him on the road selling. So as part of that program, we had 10 stakeholder interviews. And here's the thing about collecting data. When you're collecting data as a consultant and you're feeding back to someone when you're interviewing a bunch of people, the important part of when you're giving that feedback, it has to have just enough sting to wake that person up, and then just enough love to motivate them to want to take action. So we did the partner feedback intervention where we gave them the feedback, and then the partners spoke to him, and we did 6 months of leadership coaching, and the outcome was he was more focused. We worked on his triggers, because we have a whole protocol for dissolving the neurochemistry associated with traumatic memory that we use in our practice. So we work from the inside out and the outside in. And I actually asked him after 6 months, so what do you think the impact was? I said, when you think monetarily, and he said, oh, easily, $18 million. So I want to take some more questions. We've got some time. What other questions do you have? Any other real situations? No questions? You all got it? Okay. Question.
two, you can't get past that often with combative people and children. They will not agree on the facts. And they'll never get to point 4, 5, and 6. It's very cool if you're someone's boss because they don't want to get fired. They have a motivation to be there, to cooperate.
That's right.
But in UN and in dramatic people who are just combative, as well as children, they don't seem to have any motivation, the same as you, to get to that, we'll give you a compliment and let's agree on the facts. Often you just stay on disagreeing on the facts, and then you'll never get to the next step, which is, oh, we all agree on how we got here.
That's because, and I'll tell you why that is. So first of all, there's a lot of nuance in that question and the statement underneath the question. First of all, with kids, depending on how old they are, right, is how much they can be rational. But I've actually worked in some of the toughest schools. I worked with over 1,000 kids right after grad school in some of the toughest schools in the 5 boroughs in the Bronx and Washington Heights. And so I've worked with kids who are dealing with conflict and leadership. And the key there is to teach them how do you actually feed back the anger, the frustration that someone else is saying, to surround them with their own truth and calm them down. That's how these UN leaders work with those rebel factional leaders. I'm not saying that I can inject that into you right now so you can understand it, right? You just kind of have to, my experience is you can learn it, and that piece is learning how to de-escalate the situation very quickly by surrounding someone with their own pain. Because it's the pain and the suffering and the perception that you don't understand how I think and feel. So if you can surround them with, I do understand how you think and feel, then you are able to get them to a place where they can understand. That's in my experience. Okay, yeah.
So you talked about very important skills.
Yes.
But isn't the answer, as it was with Kim, it's really how good the solution is.
Do you have a situation you're talking
I don't. I'm just thinking this example. You can empathize, you can get her to come in. But if she doesn't have the power to speak,
But she does have the power to speak, Charles. Remember, what we're doing here is performance management. Yes, that's what this session is about. Oh, no. But Charles is a separate problem. Right now, we're dealing with Kim. Let me explain what I meant by that.
That's really what I'm getting at. The underlying, you can get the volume. Right.
Yes.
But the problem is solved.
The problem is only...
If you don't take care of Charles,
Yes.
Charles is still not...
I get it. So for you, if we don't take care of Charles, right? Charles needs to have his behavior changed. So I just did what I told him I did. I just actually surrounded you with your own truth. Do you notice what I did? And I got a nod of your head. Okay, so now I can answer the question because now we're at a space of understanding. So the next step for Charles is I might coach, there are a lot of options with Charles. I might coach Charles. I might coach her on how to handle Charles. That's just the next problem to deal with. So you're absolutely right. And the answer is, yeah, they're right. Charles is a problem. Now we either deal with Charles in whatever way, depending on how Charles is. Does that answer your question? Cool. Anybody else? Yeah.
All right, so I referee soccer.
You what?
I referee soccer.
Oh, we're going with kids again.
And we have this technique when we're dealing with coaches called ask, tell, dismiss.
Okay.
And it's almost like your diagram.
Oh, good.
And we're going to say, Coach, you're yelling at the other referees. I'm asking you to calm down.
All right.
And keeps coming. I come over and I say, I tell the coach, you have to knock it off now.
Yeah.
Because the next thing you come over, if he does it again, he's dismissed. So
How's that
it's very
working?
similar.
How's that working for you?
Sometimes I go right to dismiss. So.
All right. So we have some more time. And yeah, go ahead.
Any tips for dealing with people who just love to be positioned? If there's some people that, no matter what you do, they're going to create the opposite position.
So it all comes down to when you understand the nuances of each of these steps, it will all become clear to you, but it's going to take practice, right? So someone who loves being positional, loves being argumentative, loves to maybe be in control, is this a drivery kind of person? And do they report to you? Do they report to you, this person?
I'm just asking you a question.
I know. And this, So in order to put it in a context, if this person reports to you, because that's our session's about, right? Somebody report, this is managing down. So, because I can't answer every question about conflict in the world. If I had 3 days, I could do it. So I got to put it in this context. I could. So let's say that this person who loves to argue reports to you. Another concept is, how do you have a meta conversation? A meta conversation is a conversation about how we're communicating that takes you out of the content of the conflict, and suddenly you're up and looking at it from down here. And that's why one of the things I've noticed, where you begin to wake this person up, I don't know if you've noticed, but it seems as though, and you describe it, there have been 3 or 4 times when you and I've kind of gotten into it. Have you noticed that? Now that person is yeah, I've kind of noticed that. Well, how do you think that's working for you in the context of getting things done? See what I did? That's a meta conversation. So because he can keep pushing up against you positionally, but if you pull him out through the meta conversation, then that's great questions, by the way. Yeah.
How do you deal with the converse in that situation where an individual's role is to be an expediter, an escalator, and a solution driver?
Yeah.
Too nice and too unpositional.
Yeah.
If you go through this, or they got with you back and forth, you say, okay, yeah, I'll do all these things completely really deep as well. They're just too nice.
They're too nice because what's the downstream impact of their being too nice?
Deliverables are not met. Engineers do not report out on time to feel sense of urgency to drive solutions and change which will delay the impact of others.
And how aware is this person of the downstream impact of their behavior?
They've been given feedback.
They what?
They've been given feedback multiple times.
So my question is, because oftentimes when I say they've been given feedback multiple times, the magic is, did you come up with a future-focused agreement where they clearly understood the impact of their behavior downstream? Because here's the truth. How many people here have noticed that when you became a manager and all your past colleagues suddenly got a lot dumber? You notice that? Some of you have noticed that. Suddenly, that's because when you get to a higher level, you're able to see things that others don't see. And especially my alumni leaders, you begin to see things. If you become the president I was president of Teachers College Alumni Association, you begin to see things that others can't see. So it is your job to make sure they understand the impact of their behavior and that it comes out of their mouth and that they make a future-focused agreement. Now, what if this person keeps doing it? That's the next question, right? So this is called power of 3. So the first time you have this conversation, it's a future-focused agreement. The second time you have this conversation, you say, I know we had this conversation before. I mean, what happened? The reason we come up with an agreement is because you don't have to re-legislate the entire conversation again. You can say, I remember we talked about, maybe you're being a little too nice, and looks like this happened again. The deliverable wasn't met. What happened? Open-ended question. They have to explain. Third time, you say, this is the third time we've had this conversation. It's called power of 3. What do we know about the number 3 when it comes to feedback? When you think back, when you were 5 or 6 years old, how did your parents motivate you? 1, 2, 2.5. We all know what happens when we get to 3. So if you say, this is the third time, you can still be in intelligent confusion because you're coming from a place of wanting to help this person, right? And the more you realize how beautiful intelligent confusion is in ameliorating some of these conflicts you're pushing against or running from, the greater it is. And it comes with practice. So once you get to the third time, now you can begin to move to a formal process through HR, and so then you begin to ask the question, so what are you committed to? Because I've noticed it's the third time we've had this conversation. Maybe this role isn't right for you. Maybe I can find you a role somewhere else, and you begin to have that conversation. Okay, does that answer your question? Okay. All right, so you know what we have time for? We have time. Would you guys like to actually take a 4-quadrant assessment and see what your own style is? Can we hand those out? Have they already handed them out? Some of you got them, some of you didn't. But you did get it. How did you get it and others didn't? Whatever, we're all going to get one. It looks, hold it up. It looks like this. It's a couple of pages. It's coming around. Kathleen, can you help? Can you help her hand out? Can you help hand out? Here it is. Can you hand it out? Great. And maybe Kathleen can take a stack. Anybody else? Okay, so let's have some fun. Here's what you're going to do. There are 4 columns on that first page. There are, yes there are. And you're going to put a check mark next to the word that describes you. Now, if you thought that every single word in every column was you, you would go ahead and put a check mark, but that's probably not the case. So be honest about it. And here's a little hint. If there's a word there and you're not sure that if that word describes you, but your husband, wife, boyfriend, or girlfriend says that's you, it probably is. So put a check mark. You're going to add up the check marks, and then you're going to start in the succeeding pages by looking what is the highest number of check marks, and you're going to read that page and see if that describes you. And then the second highest number of check marks, maybe that's your secondary style. If you have the same number of check marks in your columns, then maybe you're both those styles, but really, because you can't really have high reliability and validity with an assessment like this, but there is a lot of, people do seem to get a lot of value from it. So you get to decide by reading those descriptions, sort of what's my primary, secondary style, read all 4 of them and decide which is my Achilles heel, which of these styles is the lowest for me, because that's the person in the organization that it's their highest style that's probably going to give me the biggest problems. Because we both have preferences for how we deal with difficult conversations.
In your practice, have you found gender-based differences
Yes.
between these 4?
Oh, between the 4? Not so much. You might think, I'm not sure what studies that they've done. Yeah, because you would naturally think that because women tend to be more relator-oriented, that would be true. Well, you think about what it takes to succeed in financial services and that kind of behavior. I've had examples from all 4, so I don't know of any studies. The best work on gender differences right now that I think is Sylvia Hewlett. If you're interested in women in leadership, Sylvia Hewlett, forget about a sponsor, forget about a mentor, get a sponsor. It's terrific work. We did a day and a half at a pharmaceutical with just training women on that leadership model. It's fantastic. Yep. Sylvia Hewlett, forget about a mentor, ladies, get a sponsor. Someone who's going to back you for that next step. Hewlett, like Hewlett-Packard.
Oh, wow.
The response for someone who finds that they're dealing one way in the professional setting and one way in the personal setting is good for you for noticing that. The goal here is not to be put into a box. The goal is to be situationally appropriate and aware of what's tripping me up. So here's how you can use this. You notice that for each style, there's a box of strengths and challenges. Everybody pay attention for a second. Notice, because I invite you to take this throughout the day and just notice how you interact with other people to become more aware for yourself. But if you see the boxes, may I for a second? If you see the boxes that say strengths and challenges, right? So say if you look at relator, amiable, easygoing, relaxed, good at finishing what they start. They like things doing one thing at a time. If you want to influence these people, what you want to do is you want to mirror back some aspect of their style, either through talking slower. It's very simple. Either talking slower to match their style or through lower affect. Because if I'm a high expressive, do you have somebody who knows they're an analytical? Who here knows they're an analytical? All right, so what's your name? Stephen. So if I'm working with Stephen and I'm highly expressive, and I have this great idea for Stephen, and Stephen, you gotta listen to this is great. And I begin to move closer. Already, I'm intruding on his boundaries. This is not cool. So, am I right? Yes, he's already putting his hands up. That's how it is. So what happens? What I observe in Stephen is, because he's low affect, right, that I think he's not getting my great idea. So what we do is we tend to do more of what we know. So I say to myself, well, he's not getting it, so I got to be even more enthusiastic. Drives positional escalation. So if you simply tone down and slow down and say, Stephen, do you have a minute to talk? There's this great idea. I don't know. I'd love to get your feedback on it because I don't really know if I have the details right. Already that's like candy. Because analyticals are really interested in solving problems and setting up systems and details. So that's already going to be interesting to him instead of, let me tell you about what this is. Right? So just the change in tone and rate of speech can make a difference. Okay? Other questions? It's a great question.
Does sometimes it depend on the situation as to what you are?
Yes. Well, so the goal of this is to begin to notice, because there are people that maybe are, because this is all about how much energy do we put into this particular focus? How much energy do we put into driving results versus how much energy do we put into expressing ideas and focusing on the future versus how much energy do we put on the people and making sure that there's consensus versus how much energy do we put into making sure that it's right and we have a system and process. You see how all four of those things are important to be a whole person to drive results? See how that's important? So now, the goal here is to begin to notice your own behavior. Is there one place in some of these challenges where I get stuck? Like read the boxes. Maybe I'm a little bit of all three. There are some people that are like that. They're 3 above what's called the energy line. Goal really is just like, yes, be situationally appropriate in the ways that I've described. Other questions? Yes. Yep. The expressive is ideas and the future salespeople. Natural salespeople, natural presenters. Applause, recognition. Hey, everybody, look at me. And real charming, but try to get to the meeting on time, maybe not so much. Try to be organized, maybe not so much. Get the report in on time, maybe not so much. Who are we driving crazy with that? The analyticals, those people that are directly, if you look at that last page, directly across. Other questions? All right, so, because we still have 15 minutes. Do you guys want any more? Are we done, or do you want some more information? More? Have I? So, all right. So my close is, so I'll do the close now, and then I'm gonna give you a little more information. So the close is that if you can really work on these skills, all right, work on practicing some of these principles, you'll save time, money, and resources, and you'll sleep better at night.